So now we are going to get into the last chapter of the book, Autumn 1935. We're going to read this, I will be reading it out loud from beginning to end. But as you read, there are a couple things that you need to remember to do. As you read, you have to take notes on at least 3 passages that contain a sign of hope. You're going to write these down. These 3 passages that contain a sign of hope. What signs of hope are they mentioning? So by 3 passages, 3, it could be a sentence from a specific poem. So just like we did in video lesson number 4, you will set up a piece of paper with split notes. I have provided the split note document on Schoology for you to just fill out. If there is no need to create them yourselves, but basically after we finish reading each poem, think to yourself, pause the video if you need to, note any signs of hope that you saw that happened in that poem. Maybe it is a hint that the future will be better. Perhaps it is a hint that people's lives will be happier. Any sign of hope is good. When you find a passage or a sentence, write it down. Make sure to rewind if you need to, rewind the video, but write that sentence down. So on your split notes, on the left hand side, the more narrow column will be the name of the poem which gave you that sign of hope, and on the right, on the details side, you're going to write that sentence that signifies some level of hope, whatever it is. One more thing, do not forget to add quotations around that sentence from the text, because it's coming word for word from the text. And after you add quotations at the end, in parentheses, if you can tell the page number from me showing you the page, then go ahead and also include the page number in parentheses at the end. In the given case that you prefer to read by yourself, then I will be showing you the page, the poem pages here, the last chapter, Autumn 1935. So pause and read this chapter, or you can skip forward a little bit and hear me read it out loud. This will also be included on Schoology as a file, so you can have the video open and this at the same time to follow along. That's the end. The last chapter, Autumn 1935. If I remember correctly, we started with winter 1934, and we read on. And so we're at the next year, autumn 1935, at the end of the next year. Cut in deep. I went in with Daddy to see Doc rise. Doc said, "Why'd you wait so long to show someone those spots, Bayard?" I scowled at Daddy. He looked at the wall. I think he didn't care much if he had some cancer and took and died. Figure he'd see Ma then. He'd see my brother. It'd be out of his hands. He'd be out of the dust. Now he's going to wear bandages where Doc cut the cancer out, the best he could. And we have to wait and hope Daddy didn't get help too late. I asked Doc about my hands. "What," I say, "can I do with them?" Doc looks carefully at the mottled skin, the stretched and striped and crackled skin. "Quit picking at them," he says. "Rub some ointment in them before you go to bed," he says. "And use them, Billy Joe," he says. "They'll heal up fine if you just use them." Daddy sits on my bed, and I open the boxes, the two boxes that have been in my closet for years now. The dust is over everything, but I blow it off, and Daddy is so quiet when he sees some of the things that are still so strong of Ma. And we end up keeping everything but a palm full of broken doll dishes. I thought once to go through these boxes with Ma, but Daddy is sitting on the edge of my bed. My mouth feels cottony. I fix dinner, and Daddy tells me about when he was a boy. He says, I wasn't always sure about the wheat, about the land, about life in the panhandle. I dreamed of running off too, though I never did. I didn't have half your sauce, Billy Joe, he says, and it's the first time I ever knew there was so much to the two of us, so much more than our red hair and our long legs and the way we rub our eyes when we're tired. October 1935. The other woman. Okay, here we go. Other woman. Her name is Louise. She stayed by Daddy the days I was away. The first time I met her, she came to dinner bringing 2 baskets of food. She's a good cook, without showing off. She has a way of making my father do things. When Louise came to dinner, Daddy got up and cleaned the kitchen when we were done eating. He tied an apron around his middle, and he looked silly as a cow stuck in a hole, but Louise ignored that, and I took a lesson from her. We walked around the farm, even though she'd probably already seen it while I was gone. She didn't ask to be taken to my favorite places, the loft in the barn, the banks of the beaver, the fields where you can see Black Mesa on a clear day. She told me she knew Daddy and I had a history before her, and she wished she'd been there for the whole thing, but she wasn't, and there wasn't anything to do but get over it and get on. We both stared in wonder at the pond my daddy made. And she said, a hole like that says a lot about a man. I didn't intend to, but I liked her because she was so plain and so honest, and because she made Daddy laugh, and me, too, just like that. And even though I didn't know if there was room for her and me, I could see there was room for her and Daddy. When I asked him if he wanted me to go off to Aunt Ella's after all, Daddy said he hadn't ever wanted it. He said I was his own, and he didn't like to think about what Aunt Ellis might do with me. And we laughed, picturing me and Aunt Ellis together. And it wasn't a nice laugh, but it was Aunt Ellis we were talking about after all. The thing about Louise, I'll just have to watch how things go and hope she doesn't crowd me out of Daddy's life. Not now, when I am just finding my way back into it. October 1935. Not everywhere. I walk with Daddy up the slope and look out over the Beaver River. Louise is back at the house. She wanted to come, but this is Ma's place. Ma's grave, Franklin's too, and Louise has no business here. She wants to come everywhere with us. Well, I won't let her. Not everywhere. Daddy says she could have come. There's room enough for everyone, Billy Joe. But there's not. She can come into Ma's kitchen. She can hang around the barn. She can sit beside Daddy when he drives the truck. But Ma's bones are in this hill, Ma's and Franklin's, and their bones wouldn't like it if Louise came walking up here between us. October 1935. What kinds of emotions do you think Billy Joe is feeling now? See if these change, if these are shifting. Keep considering the theme behind these poems. What is the theme? We know the topic, right? Topic in a lot of this is the new woman. We know the topic in some of these poems was the skin of Billy Joe's dad. It was Billy Joe leaving, right? Running away was a topic, but the theme Remember, it's deeper than that. What is the author trying to tell us about that topic? What do we get from a poem like that dealt with Billy Joe running away, with Daddy's skin being cancer, with a new woman being in Billy Joe's house? What is the theme? My life, or what I told Louise after the 10th time she came to dinner. I may look like Daddy, but I have my mother's hands. Piano hands, Ma called them, sneaking a look at them any chance she got. A piano is a grand thing, I say. Though ours is covered in dust now. Under the grime it's dark brown like my mother's eyes. I think about the piano and how above it hangs a mirror, and to either side of that mirror, shelves where Ma and Daddy's wedding picture once stood, though Daddy has taken that down. Whenever she could, Ma filled a bowl with apples, I'd tell Louise. I'm crazy about apples, and she filled a jar with wildflowers when she found them and put them on that shelf above the piano. On the other shelf, Ma's book of poetry remains, and the invitation from Aunt Ellis, or what's left of it. Daddy and I tore it into strips to mark the poems we thought Ma liked best. We weren't always happy, I tell Louise, but we were happy enough until the accident. When I rode the train west, I went looking for something, but I didn't see anything wonderful. I didn't see anything better than what I already had. Home. I look straight into Louise's face. Louise doesn't flinch. She looks straight back. I'm the first one to back down. But my hands don't look real pretty anymore. But they hardly hurt. They only ache a little sometimes. I could play right now, maybe, if I could get the dust out of the piano. If I wanted to get the dust out of the piano. But I don't. I'm not ready yet. And what I like best about her is Louise doesn't say what I should do. She just nods. And I know she's heard everything I said, and some things I didn't say, too. November 1935. November dust. The wheat is growing, even though dust blows in sometimes. I walk with Daddy around the farm and see that the pond is holding its own. It will keep Ma's apple trees alive, nourish her garden, help the grass around it grow. Enough to lie in and dream, if I feel like it, and stand in and wait for Mad Dog when he comes past once a week on his way from Amarillo, where he works for the radio. And as long as the dust doesn't crush the winter wheat, we'll have something to show in the spring for all Daddy's work. Not a lot, but more than last year. November 1935. Thanksgiving list. Prairie birds, the whistle of gophers, the wind blowing, the smell of grass and spicy earth. Friends like Mad Dog, the cattle down in the river, water washing over their hooves, the sky so big, so full of shifting clouds, the cloud shadows creeping over the fields, Daddy's smile and his laugh and his songs, Louise, food without dust, Daddy singing to Ma's piano, newly cleaned and tuned, the days when my hands don't hurt at all, the thank you note from Lucille in Moline, Kansas, the sound of rain, Daddy's hole staying full of water, and the wind as the windmill turns, the smell of green, of damp earth, of hope returning to our farm, the poppies set to bloom on Ma's and Franklin's grave, the morning with the whole day waiting, full of promise, the night of quiet, of no expectations, of rest, and the certainty of home, the one I live in, and the one that lives in me. November 1935. Thanksgiving list that was. And we have, just like that, we have about 4 more poems left. Let's keep going. Music. I'm getting to know the music again, and it is getting to know me. We sniff each other's armpits, and inside each other's ears, and behind each other's necks. We are both confident and a little sassy. And I know now that all the time I was trying to get out of the dust, the fact is, what I am because of the dust. And what I am is good enough, even for me. November 1935. Teamwork. Louise and I take walks after dinner, every time she comes. By the time we get back, the kitchen looks pretty good. Daddy only leaves a few things he doesn't understand, like big pans and wooden spoons and leftovers, and that makes me a little irritated, but mostly it makes me love him. And Louise, knowing exactly what's left to be done, helps me finish up. She was my father's teacher at the ninth school class. She never married. She went to college for 2 years and studied and worked, and didn't notice how lonely she was until she met Daddy and fell into the big hurt of his eyes. She knows how to keep a home, and she knows how to cook. She knows how to make things last through winters and drought. She knows how to smooth things between 2 red-headed people, and she knows how to come into a home and not step on the toes of a ghost. I still feel grateful she didn't make cranberry sauce last month at the first Thanksgiving we spent together. Louise made sweet potatoes and green beans and turkeys and 2 pies, pumpkin and chocolate. I was so full. My lids sighed shut, and Daddy walked with Louise instead of me. Out to Ma and Franklin's grave, where he let Ma know his intentions, and Ma's bones didn't object, neither did mine. And when they came back to the house, Daddy still cleaned the kitchen. December 1935. In this poem, she mentioned the cranberry sauce, how she felt grateful that Louise hadn't made cranberry sauce. Maybe we'll remember back to the beginning of the book. Why was that cranberry sauce important? Finding a way. Daddy started talking about planting the rest of the acres in wheat, but then said, no, let's just go with what we've got right now. And I've been playing a half hour every day, making the skin stretch, making the scars stretch. The way I see it, hard times aren't only about money or drought or dust. Hard times are about losing spirit and hope and what happens when dreams dry up. The tractor's busted. We don't have the cash to fix it, but there's nothing saying Daddy can't do the work by hand. It can't be any harder than digging a hole 60 by 6 feet deep. Daddy bought a second mule with Louise's help, her betrothal gift to him. He walks behind the team, step by step, listing the fields to fight the wind. Maybe the tractor lifted him above the land. Maybe the fields didn't know him anymore, didn't remember the touch of his feet, or the stroke of his hands, or the bones of his knees. And why should wheat grow for a stranger? Daddy said he'd try some sorghum, maybe some cotton, admitting us how there might be something to this notion of diversification folks were talking about. And yes, he'd bring the grass back like Mom wanted, where he wasn't planting anything else. He'd make new sod, and I'm learning, watching Daddy, that you can stay in one place and still grow. I wipe dust out of the roasting pan. I wipe dust off Ma's dishes and wait for Daddy to drive in with Louise, hoping she'll stay a little later, a little longer, waiting for the day when she stays for good. She wears a comical hat with flowers in December, and when she smiles,
Her face is full enough of springtime, it makes her hat seem just right. She brings apples in a sack. Perfect apples she arranges in a bowl on the shelf, opposite the book of poetry. Sometimes while I'm at the piano, I catch her reflection in the mirror, standing in the kitchen, soft-eyed, while Daddy finishes chores. And I stretch my fingers over the keys, and I play. December 1935. And that was the end.
Okay, now this is an excerpt from the last poem in the novel. It comes from the poem called Finding a Way. Now, what it is essentially the paragraph has two words that we're going to focus on. Underneath your set of split notes, that Word document will have space, will have a spot for you to define these two words. I want you to consider what is the meaning of the words in bold, what context clues can you use to help you, what is the connection between this passage and other texts. So not only will you define these two words, telling me what context clues helped you, but you will also answer the second question here, what connection exists between this passage and other texts that we have read. Other texts meaning not our novel, not our book, but still part of the unit. Well, let me read this excerpt to you. Daddy said he'd try some sorghum, maybe some cotton, admitting as how there might be something to this notion of diversification folks were talking about. And yes, he'd bring the grass back, like Mom wanted, where he wasn't planting anything else. He'd make new sod. So just from reading this and using context clues, sorghum must be a type of what? What do you think it could be? What part of speech we're going to consider, what can help you is to consider what type of speech is diversification. The ending ation makes me understand that this is a noun, that it's something, it's a thing, it's a noun. So either nouns are person, places, or things. Well, this right here is a thing. So we know it's a thing, and we know what diverse means. So what is diversification? What idea is presented in this first part of the excerpt that will help you know what diversification is? So these three lines at the top of diversification give an example of diversification. So based off of that, what do you think it means? What topic is being explored in this passage? If you think about the topic, that can help you with these definitions. And lastly, what did we learn about planting different crops? What article did we read? If you remember, what article did we read that described this practice of growing different plants instead of just one thing? Okay, so go ahead and define these two words on your Word document and answer what connection exists between this passage and other texts. Now, underneath those two definitions and that question that you answered, you will see another set of split notes. This is our last set of split notes, and what it is basically a setup for this slide. We have finished reading the entire novel, so now it's time to talk about the theme, about what themes the author explored throughout the novel. We focused on themes in specific poems, but how about throughout the novel? In other words, which themes were explored over and over again in the poems which make up the entire novel? Our split notes are basically on the main idea heading side. On the left side, we have themes in novel. On the left, right? Themes in the novel. And that way on the right, the wider side, we are going to list 3 theme statements and evidence. So 3 theme statements and evidence. Which theme recur throughout the novel. So making a list of 3 statements that apply to the novel as a whole. What evidence do you find in the story for each statement? So you will notice that in your split notes, not only on the left-hand side do you have what we're doing, we're looking at themes in the novel, but then on the right, you will have 2 things to do. You're going to have space to write 3 different theme statements and also space to write evidence. Think about what happens. You don't have to name specific poems since you don't have your book. You don't have to name the titles, but do tell me what happens in the book that makes you really, really think that that's a theme in the whole entire book. If you're still having trouble with developing your theme statements, then I want you to take a look at the bottom of your handout. There are questions that can be guiding questions that will help you really come up with the best theme statements, such as, what does Billy Jo learn about herself? Answering this question can help you get at the theme of the poem, of the book, What does Daddy learn about farming? Daddy's and farming happens throughout the whole book. So what is something he learns? What do the townspeople learn about hardship? What does the dust teach the farmers? What major changes take place in Billy Jo from the beginning of the story to the end? You see how all of these focus on the entire novel. So your theme statement will be it could be between 1 to 2 sentences. And there are many more than just 3. But all I'm asking is for 3. Alright, so for the last week of school, you all are going to be responsible for completing a research project. This research project will be an article, essentially writing a news article, and you will get more details about it in next week's video. But for now, what we're going to do right now is actually going to come in handy for that research project, because in that research project, that news article I was speaking about, it's going to ask you to include descriptive details. In that article, you need to include examples, statistics, anecdotes. So all of these things are things that we need to have in mind, and we're going to practice with. So for this, we'll read an article called 10 Things You May Not Know About the Dust Bowl. And as I read, we're going to be completing this elaboration methods chart, where you can see in the left-hand side, it says descriptive details, examples, statistics, anecdotes. We're going to take notes of when the author in the article that we're going to be reading is using descriptive details. When is he or she using examples? When is he or she using statistics or anecdotes? Anecdotes are stories about people. So, just a brief overview. We have descriptive details, and descriptive details means when the author gives us details in the form of descriptions, full of words and phrases that allows us to see what is happening, right? Really descriptive. Examples. The author gives us details in the form of examples of what he is talking about. We're very familiar with examples. So if he says there's something that happened, well, he's going to give us an example of a person who experienced it. Then statistics. The author gives us details in the form of numbers or figures or charts or measurements. Statistics are important because it makes us be able to believe the article a lot better once we are offered a certain type of number or an idea of how many people, for example, a good measure of how many people either experienced something or went through a certain event. And then we have anecdotes. Anecdotes are really important, and that's when the author gives us details in the form of stories. So it can be similar to examples. but it's more than anything, it's a lot of anecdotes have to do with a little bit more of a story kind of feel to it. So we'll see how the author is using these. So follow along as I read, and we'll pause after after a paragraph or two, and you are going to add to your chart. You can type up what examples of these things were used in this article. 10 things you may not know about the Dust Bowl. Explore 10 surprising facts about America's epic drought disaster, the Dust Bowl. One monster dust storm reached the Atlantic Ocean. While black blizzards constantly menaced plain states in the 1930s, a massive dust storm 2 miles high traveled 2,000 miles before hitting the East Coast on May 11, 1934. So East Coast of the United States would be here, where we have states like New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. That would be the East Coast in comparison to the West Coast, which would be California. But this is talking about the East Coast was hit. For 5 hours, a fog of prairie dirt enshrouded landmarks such as the Statue of Liberty and the U.S. Capitol, inside which lawmakers were debating a soil conservation bill. For East Coasters, the storm was a mere inconvenience. Housewives kept busy, read a New York Times subhead, compared to the tribulations endured by the Dust Bowl residents. So once again, the Dust Bowl residents here experienced tribulations, experienced hardship because of the dust storm. And for the East Coast people, it was just a mere inconvenience, not a big, huge hardship like it had been for the Dust Bowl people. So now that we have read that first one, I want you to complete the chart, or not necessarily complete the whole thing because we haven't finished reading the article, but I want you to fill out what sentences from this first paragraph included either descriptive details, examples, statistics, or anecdotes. I can tell you that there was already numbers, right? There were some numbers here. How much did the storm travel? Well, that was specifically a statistic. So I'll keep reading, and I want you to pause after I read a paragraph and add to your chart. The Dust Bowl was both a man-made and natural disaster. Beginning with World War I, American wheat harvests flowed like gold as demand boomed. Lured by record wheat prices, that means wheat prices were high, farmers were getting paid a lot for their wheat, and promises by land developers that rain follows the plow, farmers powered by new gasoline tractors overplowed and overgrazed the southern plains. When the drought and Great Depression hit in the early 1930s, the wheat market collapsed. Once the oceans of wheat, which replaced the sea of prairie grass that anchored the topsoil into place, dried up, the land was defenseless against the winds that buffeted the plains. Both a man-made and natural disaster. So pause and add. Next. 3. The ecosystem disruption unleashed plagues of jackrabbits and grasshoppers. If the dust storms that turned daylight to darkness weren't apocalyptic enough, seemingly biblical plagues of jackrabbits and grasshoppers descended on the plains and destroyed whatever meager crops could grow. To combat the hundreds of thousands of jackrabbits that overran the Dust Bowl, Dust Bowl states of 1935, some towns staged rabbit drives in which townsmen corralled the jackrabbits in pens and smashed them to death with clubs and baseball bats. Thick clouds of grasshoppers, as large as 23,000 insects per acre, according to one estimate, also swept over farms and consumed everything in their wakes. What the sun left, the grasshoppers took, President Franklin D. Roosevelt said during a fireside chat. The National Guard was called out to crush grasshoppers with tractors and burn infested fields, while the Civilian Conservation Corps spread an insecticide and of arsenic, molasses, and bran. So remember this whole idea of apocalypse. It seemed like a lot of things were like the world is going to end. Food was very low and all of that. So maybe you can start building connections between even with what you see happening in the world today and what happened in our story with the dust storms and things just seem to be getting worse, right? We've had a lot of events, more than just the virus that is going around, that makes it seem like we're living in an apocalyptic time, sort of. So don't forget to start thinking about some of these connections, because it will help when it comes time to your project. Also, this part about the president, right, having some type of role during this time can remind you of today, right? There is definitely a lot of that the president, that we look to the president to do during times like these. And so did people back then during the dust storms. All right, 4. Don't forget to pause and add to your chart. Proposed solutions were truly out of the box. There were few things desperate Dust Bowl residents didn't try to make it rain. Some followed the old folklore of killing snakes and hanging them belly up on fences. Others tried shock and awe. Farmers in one Texas town paid a self-professed rainmaker $500 to fire off rockets carrying an explosive mixture of dynamite and nitroglycerin to induce showers. Corporations also touted their products to the federal government as possible solutions. Sizzlecraft proposed covering the farms with waterproof paper, while a New Jersey asphalt company suggested paving the plains. 5. A newspaper reporter gave the Dust Bowl its name. Associated Press reporter Robert Geiger, which we studied, opened his April 15, 1935 dispatch with this line: 3 little words, achingly familiar on a Western farmer's tongue, rule life in the Dust Bowl of the continent. If it rains. If it rains. Dust Bowl was probably a throwaway line for Geiger, since 2 days later he referred to the disaster zone as the Dust Belt. Nevertheless, within weeks, the term had entered the National Lexicon. That's the National Dictionary. So those, just by using these words in this first time using these words in this article that he wrote, the Dust Bowl ended up becoming known as that the region started becoming known as that. So thanks to this reporter. So this paragraph is probably good for some of the chart stuff, right? Descriptive details, maybe how the Dust Bowl got its name, or examples. Okay. 6. Dust storms crackled with powerful static electricity. So much static electricity built up between the ground and airborne dust that blue flames leapt from barbed wire fences, and well-wishers shaking hands could generate a spark so powerful it could knock them to the ground. Right? That's an example of what could happen. So the author right here is using an example of what could happen. Alright, telling us that well-wishers shaking hands could generate a spark so powerful it could knock them to the ground. Also very descriptive, so you could choose which where to put some of these lines. Since static electricity could short out engines and car radios, motorists driving through dust storms dragged chains from the back of their automobiles to ground their cars. The swirling dust proved deadly. Those who inhaled the airborne prairie dust suffered coughing spasms, shortness of breath, asthma, bronchitis, and influenza. Much like miners, Dust Bowl residents exhibited signs of silicosis from breathing in extremely fine silt particulates, which had high silica content. Dust pneumonia, called the brown plague, killed hundreds and was particularly lethal for infants, children, and elderly. That right here sounds to me a lot like a statistic. Right, maybe it killed hundreds and particularly lethal for these people. 8. The federal, more statistics it seems like over here. So don't forget to add. The federal government paid farmers to plow under fields and butcher livestock. As part of Roosevelt's New Deal, the federal government purchased starving livestock for at least $1 a head. Livestock, and that's animals, healthy enough to be butchered, could fetch as much as $16 a head, with the meat used to feed homeless people living in Hoovervilles. The Soil Conservation Service, established in 1935, paid farmers to leave fields idle. That means to do nothing to them. They paid them to do nothing to their fields. Employ land management techniques such as crop rotation and replant native prairie grasses. The federal government also bought more than 10 million acres and converted them to grasslands, some managed today by the U.S. Forest Service. 9. Most farm families did not flee the Dust Bowl. John Steinbeck's story of migrating tenants, farmers in his Pulitzer Prize-winning 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, tends to obscure the fact that upwards of 3/4 of farmers, another statistic, in the Dust Bowl stayed put. Dust Bowl refugees did not flood California. Only 6,000 of the 1.2 million migrants to California during the 1930s came from the drought-stricken region. Most Dust Bowl refugees tended to move only to neighboring states. So just contrary to popular belief, they did not always just flood to California. Not as many as it made it seem like in this book, in this novel, and maybe even in our novel. Now, 10, the last one. Few Okies were actually from Oklahoma. Remember, Okies is the name that is given to Oklahoma, people from Oklahoma. While farm families migrating to California during the 1930s, like the fictitious Joad family, were often derided as Okies, only 1/5 of them, right? Only 1/5 of them were actually from Oklahoma. Plus, many of those Oklahoma migrants were from the eastern part of the state, outside of the Dust Bowl. Okie was a blanket term used to describe all agricultural migrants, no matter their home states. They were greeted with hostility and signs, such as one in a California diner that read, "Okies and dogs not allowed inside." So here's where we are now. We have finished reading the article, and as you read, you took notes on your elaboration methods handout. You told me what elaboration methods were used, whether descriptive details, examples, statistics, anecdotes. You gave me a list of those. You gave me examples of each of these being used in the article. And so now I want you to answer this question at the bottom of your document. Which method of elaboration did you find the author used most frequently? So one thing you can do is look at your chart to see where do you have the most examples. Did the author use more descriptive details? Did the author give a whole bunch of examples more than everything else? Did the author use more statistics? Did the author give more stories? All of that. Having done that, in this lesson you were able to familiarize yourself with the extension task, which in this case we will look at a little bit later on, and you really started to get some practice with research. You were able to look at an article and pull things from that article that you can use to help with your final project. You also learned about methods of elaboration, and you practiced finding examples of them in a text. Good job.